What happens when a former royal walks onto late-night television expecting royal treatment, only to face the most uncomfortable 20 minutes of her life? Tonight we're diving into the explosive encounter that had Hollywood talking for weeks, when Meghan Markle stepped onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage and walked right into a masterclass in how not to handle tough questions. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about celebrity interviews that go completely off the rails. Your engagement helps this channel grow and brings you more stories like this one. The atmosphere at the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio was electric that Tuesday evening. Meghan Markle had agreed to appear on the show to promote her latest venture, a lifestyle brand that promised to revolutionize how people think about wellness and authenticity. Her publicist had been very specific about the topics that were off-limits: royal family, personal relationships, and anything remotely controversial. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his sharp wit and ability to make even the most guarded celebrities comfortable, had other plans. As Meghan walked onto the stage in a perfectly tailored cream-colored blazer, the audience erupted in applause. She waved gracefully, her media training evident in every calculated gesture. Jimmy stood up from behind his desk, that familiar smile spreading across his face as he extended his hand in greeting. "Meghan, welcome to the show," Jimmy said warmly, his voice carrying that perfect blend of enthusiasm and professionalism that had made him one of late night's most trusted hosts. "Thanks for being here tonight." "Thank you for having me, Jimmy," Meghan replied, settling into the guest chair with practiced ease. "I've been looking forward to this conversation." The first few minutes proceeded exactly as expected. Jimmy asked about her new business venture, and Meghan delivered polished responses about empowerment, authenticity, and creating positive change in the world. Her answers felt rehearsed, each word carefully chosen to avoid any potential landmines. The audience seemed engaged, but Jimmy's expression suggested he was just getting warmed up. "So, Meghan," Jimmy said, leaning back in his chair with a slight grin, "I have to ask about something that's been on a lot of people's minds. You've talked a lot tonight about authenticity and being true to yourself. How do you reconcile that message with some of the contradictions people have pointed out between your public statements and your actions?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Meghan's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered her composure. "I'm not sure what you mean by contradictions, Jimmy. I think people sometimes misunderstand the complexity of navigating public life while trying to maintain your personal values." Jimmy nodded thoughtfully, but his eyes had that glint that regular viewers knew meant he wasn't backing down. "Well, for instance, you've spoken passionately about environmental issues and the importance of reducing our carbon footprint. Yet, there have been numerous reports about your use of private jets, sometimes for relatively short trips. How do you square that circle?" Meghan's posture stiffened slightly. "I think that's a gross oversimplification of a complex issue, Jimmy. When you're in the public eye, there are security considerations and scheduling demands that the average person doesn't face. Sometimes private travel is necessary for safety reasons." "Sure, I understand that," Jimmy replied, his tone remaining conversational but persistent. "But what about the trip to the climate summit where you spoke about the urgency of environmental action? That was a 3-hour flight that you took privately instead of commercially. It seems like if the issue is truly urgent, wouldn't that be exactly the kind of sacrifice a leader should make?" The audience was completely silent now, sensing the tension building between host and guest. Meghan's media training was being put to the ultimate test, and cracks were beginning to show in her polished exterior. "I think you're missing the bigger picture here," Meghan said, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "My platform allows me to reach millions of people with important messages about sustainability and social responsibility. If I can inspire even a fraction of those people to make positive changes in their lives, then the impact far outweighs any individual choices I make about travel." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. So the ends justify the means? That's an interesting philosophy for someone who's built their brand around authenticity and accountability. That's not what I said. Meghan shot back, her composure slipping further. You're twisting my words and creating false narratives, which, frankly, I've dealt with quite enough of in my life. The mention of false narratives seemed to open a door that Jimmy had been waiting to walk through. Speaking of narratives, there's been a lot of discussion about your interview with Oprah and some of the claims that were made during that conversation. Several of those claims have since been disputed or contradicted by other sources. Do you stand by everything you said during that interview? Meghan's eyes flashed with anger. I'm not here to relitigate old conversations, Jimmy. I came here to talk about my current work and the positive impact I'm trying to make in the world. This feels like an ambush. I don't think asking straightforward questions about public statements constitutes an ambush, Jimmy replied calmly. These are things you've said publicly, things that have shaped public opinion and influenced important conversations. Surely you can understand why people might want clarity on these issues. What I understand, Meghan said, her voice rising slightly, is that no matter what I do or say, there will always be people looking for ways to tear me down. I thought you might be different, Jimmy, but it seems like you're just another person more interested in creating controversy than having a meaningful conversation. The audience was completely captivated now, watching this real-time breakdown of what was supposed to be a friendly promotional interview. Jimmy maintained his professional demeanor, but there was a steeliness in his voice that suggested he wasn't intimidated by Meghan's accusation. I think meaningful conversations require honesty and accountability, Jimmy said. And I think the audience deserves more than carefully crafted talking points when they're trying to understand who you really are and what you really stand for. Meghan leaned forward in her chair, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the armrests. You want to talk about honesty, Jimmy? Let's talk about the honest truth of what it's like to have every single word you say dissected, analyzed, and weaponized against you by people who have never walked in your shoes. Jimmy didn't flinch. That's a fair point, and I genuinely can't imagine what that pressure feels like. But with great platform comes great responsibility, right? When you have millions of people listening to your words, don't you think accuracy becomes even more important? Of course, accuracy is important, Meghan snapped. But so is context, and so is understanding that sometimes people's memories of traumatic events might not be perfect transcripts. When you're dealing with emotional pain and institutional betrayal, you're not necessarily thinking about whether every single detail will hold up to forensic analysis years later. The mention of institutional betrayal seemed to strike a nerve with Jimmy. That's actually something I wanted to ask about. You've made some pretty serious allegations about how you were treated by certain institutions. But when pressed for specific examples or evidence, the responses have been somewhat vague. Can you give us concrete examples of this institutional betrayal you're referring to? Meghan's jaw tightened. I shouldn't have to provide receipts for my own lived experience, Jimmy. The fact that you're asking me to prove my pain says everything about the problem I'm talking about. I'm not asking you to prove your pain, Jimmy replied, his voice remaining steady. Pain is real regardless of its source. But when you make public accusations that affect other people's reputations and livelihoods, I think it's reasonable to ask for some specificity. That's not about doubting your experience, it's about fairness to everyone involved. Fairness? Meghan's voice cracked with disbelief. Where was the fairness when I was being torn apart in the media on a daily basis? Where was the fairness when my mental health was crumbling and I was getting no support? You want to talk about fairness to everyone involved, but it seems like I'm the only one who's expected to provide documentation for my suffering. The raw emotion in her voice was undeniable, and for a moment, the audience seemed to feel the weight of her words. But Jimmy wasn't deterred from his line of questioning. I think your suffering is real, and I think the media scrutiny you faced was often unfair and sometimes cruel, Jimmy said, his tone softening slightly. But that doesn't mean every institution or every person who had concerns about certain claims was acting in bad faith. Is it possible that some of the pushback you received was legitimate criticism rather than coordinated attacks? Meghan stared at him in disbelief. Legitimate criticism? Jimmy, are you seriously sitting there suggesting that the racist undertones, the constant questioning of my motives, the attempts to silence me when I tried to speak my truth, that all of that was just legitimate criticism? I'm not suggesting that at all, Jimmy replied firmly. Racism is never legitimate criticism, and anyone who attacked you on those grounds was completely wrong. But criticism and racism aren't the same thing, and I think it's important to distinguish between the two. Some people might have had genuine concerns about factual accuracy or consistency without being motivated by prejudice. You know what, Jimmy? Meghan's voice was getting louder now, her media training completely abandoned. This is exactly the problem. Everything gets filtered through this lens of doubt. My pain gets questioned, my truth gets dissected, my motivations get analyzed, while the people and institutions that cause the harm get the benefit of every possible doubt. But shouldn't everyone get the benefit of some doubt? Jimmy asked. Shouldn't we all be held to the same standard of evidence and accountability? You're asking people to take your word for serious allegations, but when those same people ask for clarification or evidence, they're accused of racism or institutional bias. That seems like a double standard. Meghan was visibly shaking now, her composure completely shattered. A double standard? You want to talk about double standards? Let's talk about how every other person who sits in that chair gets softball questions about their projects and their personal lives, but I get an interrogation about my character and my credibility. That's not true, Jimmy said, his own patience beginning to show signs of strain. I've asked tough questions of plenty of guests when the situation warranted it. When someone makes public claims that affect other people, those claims become fair game for discussion. That's not personal, that's journalism. This isn't journalism, Jimmy, this is a hit job, Meghan shot back. You invited me here under false pretenses, promising a conversation about my current work, and instead you've ambushed me with a prosecutorial interrogation designed to make me look bad. I think you're making yourself look bad, Jimmy replied, his professional mask finally slipping slightly. I've asked you direct, fair questions about things you've said publicly, and instead of engaging with those questions honestly, you've deflected, played victim, and accused me of having ulterior motives. The audience gasped audibly at this exchange. The gloves were officially off now, and both host and guest were speaking with raw honesty that rarely surfaced in these polished television environments. Played victim? Meghan's voice was incredulous. Are you kidding me right now? I am a victim. Jimmy, I'm a victim of systemic racism, institutional betrayal, and media manipulation. The fact that you can sit there and dismiss that experience shows exactly how deep the problem goes. I'm not dismissing your experience, Jimmy said, his voice rising to match hers. But being a victim of some things doesn't make you immune from criticism about other things. You can be a victim of racism and still be held accountable for factual inaccuracies. You can be a victim of unfair treatment and still be expected to provide evidence for serious allegations. Evidence, 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 Meghan repeated mockingly. That's all anyone ever wants from me. Where's the evidence that the institution acted in good faith? Where's the evidence that the media coverage was fair and balanced? Where's the evidence that the criticism I received was based on facts rather than prejudice? Why is the burden of proof always on me? Jimmy leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. Because you're the one making the claims, Meghan. That's how it works. When you accuse someone or something of wrongdoing, the burden of proof is on you to support those accusations. That's not unfair, that's basic logic. Basic logic? Meghan laughed bitterly. There's nothing logical about expecting someone who's been systematically silenced and gaslit to produce perfect documentation of their abuse. The whole point of institutional power is that it operates in ways that are difficult to prove and easy to deny. So we should just take your word for it? Jimmy asked pointedly. We should accept serious allegations without question because providing evidence would be inconvenient? That's not how accountability works, for institutions or for individuals. The tension in the room was now so thick it was almost suffocating. Meghan's face was flushed with anger, her hands trembling as she gripped the chair. Jimmy maintained his professional posture, but his expression was stern and unyielding. "You know what, Jimmy?" Meghan said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I think this conversation is over. I didn't come here to be cross-examined by someone who's clearly made up his mind about me before I even walked through the door." Jimmy held up his hand, his voice remaining calm despite the escalating tension. "Meghan, I haven't made up my mind about anything. I'm asking the same questions that millions of viewers have been asking since your various public appearances. If those questions make you uncomfortable, maybe that's something worth examining." "Don't you dare psychoanalyze me," Meghan hissed, half rising from her chair. "You don't get to sit there in your comfortable little bubble and dissect my psychological state. You have no idea what I've been through, what I've sacrificed, what I've endured to get to this point." "You're absolutely right. I don't know what you've been through," Jimmy acknowledged. "But I do know what you've said publicly, and I know that some of those statements have been contradicted by other sources. I'm not questioning your pain. I'm questioning the accuracy of specific claims. There's a difference." "No, there isn't," Meghan shot back, now fully standing and facing him. "When you question my claims, you question my credibility. When you question my credibility, you question my character. When you question my character, you're doing exactly what every other institution has done to me, trying to silence me by making me seem unreliable." The audience was completely silent, mesmerized by this unprecedented breakdown of professional decorum. Jimmy remained seated, his posture calm but alert, clearly prepared for whatever might come next. "I'm not trying to silence you, Meghan. You've been talking for the last 20 minutes. But talking and communicating aren't the same thing. Communication requires listening, considering other perspectives, and engaging with challenging questions. You've done none of those things tonight." "Challenging questions?" Meghan's voice was approaching a shout now. "These aren't challenging questions, Jimmy. They're character assassinations disguised as journalism. You're not interested in understanding my perspective. You're interested in tearing me down for the entertainment of your audience." "My audience deserves honest conversations with public figures," Jimmy replied, his own voice gaining strength. "They deserve to hear how you respond when asked to clarify contradictions in your public statements. They deserve to see whether you can engage with criticism constructively or whether you immediately retreat into victimhood and accusations." "Victimhood?" Meghan's face was now bright red with fury. "You think acknowledging systematic oppression is victimhood? You think calling out institutional racism is playing the victim? This is exactly the problem, Jimmy. People like you want victims to be silent and grateful, not vocal and demanding accountability. People like me." Jimmy's eyebrows shot up. "What exactly does that mean, Meghan? Are you suggesting that my questions are motivated by some form of prejudice? Because if that's what you're implying, I think you should say it directly rather than hiding behind innuendo." Meghan paused, realizing she might have crossed a line, but her anger was too great to pull back now. "I'm saying that your questions reflect the same pattern of doubt and scrutiny that I've faced everywhere I go. The same dismissive attitude, the same demand for impossible standards of proof, the same refusal to take my word as seriously as you would take anyone else's. I would ask these same questions of anyone who made similar public claims," Jimmy stated firmly. "This has nothing to do with who you are and everything to do with what you've said. You've made serious allegations about racism, institutional cover-ups, and personal betrayals. Those allegations have real consequences for real people. Asking for specificity and evidence isn't prejudice, it's responsibility. Responsibility? Meghan laughed harshly. Where was the responsibility when the media was publishing lies about me daily? Where was the responsibility when I was being harassed and threatened? Where was the responsibility when my mental health was being destroyed by coordinated attacks? But now, suddenly, when I try to speak my truth, everyone's very concerned about responsibility. Your truth and the truth aren't necessarily the same thing, Jimmy said quietly, and those words seemed to hit Meghan like a physical blow. Excuse me? She whispered, her voice dangerous. I said your truth and the truth might not be the same thing, Jimmy repeated, his voice steady. Your truth is your perception of events, filtered through your emotions and experiences. The truth is what actually happened, verifiable by evidence and corroborated by multiple sources. Both have value, but they serve different purposes. Meghan stared at him in complete shock, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Are you seriously suggesting that my lived experience isn't real? That my perception of the racism and mistreatment I endured is somehow less valid than other people's versions of events? I'm suggesting that perception and reality don't always align perfectly, Jimmy explained. That doesn't make your experience less real or less painful, but it does mean that we need to be careful about treating subjective experiences as objective facts, especially when those experiences are used to make serious accusations about other people. This is unbelievable, Meghan said, shaking her head violently. This is absolutely unbelievable. You've just told a woman of color that her experience of racism might not be real, that her perception of mistreatment might be inaccurate, that her truth might not be the truth. Do you understand how that sounds? I understand exactly how it sounds, Jimmy replied calmly, and I understand that it's uncomfortable to hear. But discomfort doesn't make it wrong. Your race and gender don't make you immune from being asked to support your claims with evidence. Suggesting otherwise is actually patronizing. That was apparently the final straw. Meghan began removing her microphone with shaking hands, her movements sharp and angry. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. I don't have to subject myself to this kind of treatment from someone who clearly has no respect for my experience or my intelligence. Meghan, please, Jimmy said, standing up for the first time since the interview began. This conversation doesn't have to end like this. We can continue discussing these issues respectfully, even if we disagree. Respectfully? Meghan threw the microphone onto her chair. There's nothing respectful about what just happened here. You ambushed me, you dismissed my experiences, you questioned my credibility, and then you had the audacity to lecture me about truth and responsibility. That's not journalism, Jimmy. That's bullying. I think the audience can judge for themselves what just happened here, Jimmy said, his voice remaining professional even as Meghan prepared to storm off the stage. I asked you direct questions about public statements you've made, and you responded with deflection, accusations, and personal attacks. That speaks for itself. You're damn right it speaks for itself, Meghan snapped, gathering her purse and preparing to leave. It speaks to the fact that some people will never be satisfied with any answer I give because they've already decided I'm lying. Well, I'm done trying to prove myself to people who have no interest in hearing the truth. The truth is what we're trying to get to, Jimmy called after her as she began walking toward the exit. But that requires answering questions, not avoiding them. Meghan stopped and turned back one final time, her eyes blazing with fury. You want the truth, Jimmy? Here's the truth. You're exactly like every other person who's tried to tear me down over the years. You hide behind the pretense of asking tough questions, but what you're really doing is participating in the same systematic silencing that I've faced everywhere I go. Congratulations, you've just proven my point better than I ever could have. Myself. With that, she strode off the stage, leaving Jimmy standing alone behind his desk as the audience sat in stunned silence. The cameras continued rolling as Jimmy took a deep breath and addressed his viewers directly. "Well, that was certainly unexpected," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "I want to be clear about something. The questions I asked tonight were the same questions I would ask of any public figure who has made similar claims. Accountability isn't harassment, asking for evidence isn't prejudice, and expecting consistency isn't unfair treatment." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "We'll be right back after this commercial break, and when we return, we'll have a musical performance that I promise will be much more enjoyable than what you just witnessed." As the show cut to commercial, the audience remained silent, processing what they had just seen. It was clear that this wasn't just a failed interview. It was a moment that would be analyzed and debated for years to come. What do you think about celebrities who can't handle tough questions when they appear on talk shows? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories that reveal what really happens when the cameras are rolling.